Hello, everyone. This is Live Life Well TV host Robert Landau, and this is a special Live Life Well TV presentation on the Titanic. Many of you know, some of you may not, that I spent many years, close to 10 years, working on cruise ships as a cruise director. And for me, the whole topic of the Titanic is something that I will never cease to be interested in. Having been this close to death during my close to 10 years on cruise ships twice, what happened to the Titanic and what a marvelous ship she truly was interests me deeply. So I want to thank you for tuning in. I'm going to go through some of the well-known facts about the Titanic, but also some of the lesser-known facts of the Titanic. And my hope is that you will find this presentation interesting, to say the least. So, a new age had just begun. There was a continual sense of hope in the air. There was new thought. And because of that, there were also new and amazing inventions. New standards of just about everything were being challenged and met almost on a daily basis, it seemed. Things were here, but now the idea was, how do we take things to yet the next level and make life even better for ourselves? So how, in the midst of all of this renaissance, this rebirthing, could such a devastating tragedy like the sinking of the marvelous Titanic occur? It just didn't seem to fit in with everything else that was happening at that point in time, at that point in our history. Of course, the tragedy stunned the world, and it is still having that type of a ripple effect to this very day. Someone once said, how could God let the Titanic sink? Will there ever be an answer to that question? What can you do when the human ego is engaged in a selfish race for speed, extreme luxury, and corporate profit? And does the end always justify the means to reach it? All very good questions that historians and common folk, just like you and I, have been trying to answer for quite some time. So what do? If you gotta get from America to Europe or vice versa, and it's the late 1800s or the early 1900s, the answer, you cross by ship. Was everybody extremely excited about doing so? No. Would you be? Maybe. I would. But one thing would be for certain. How you would get there would have to be by ship. But the experience you had getting there could make all the difference in the world. Of course, it all depended on how much money you had in your pocket or your purse. That would decide what type of experience you'd have during your crossing. Were you crossing the ocean to become an American citizen and had no money to get there in style? Or were you coming back from a sudden shopping spree in London and almost too many nights in the theater, ballet, museums, and opera in Paris? Getting across the ocean in the years before the opulence and luxury of ships like Titanic was an experience few could tolerate, but you had to endure it if you wanted to get there. Question. See if you can guess who said the following words. When anyone asks how I can best describe my experience in nearly 40 years at sea, I merely say uneventful. Of course, there have been winter gales and storms and fog and the like, but in all my experience, I have never been in any accident of any sort worth speaking about. I never saw a wreck and never, ever have been wrecked, nor was I ever in any predicament that threatened to end in disaster of any sort. You see, I am not very good material for a story. Those words were spoken by Captain Smith, the commander, the captain of Titanic, a month or two before it sailed. I have another question for you. Do you believe that sometimes before something monumental is about to happen, there happen to be warning signs, synchronistic experiences, as some might call them? Here is some very compelling evidence that sometimes, especially in the case of the Titanic, we are literally told things that we don't often listen to or take heed of. So get this. There happens to have been, and I love this, it is absolutely amazing, see if you don't agree, there happens to be a book by a certain Mr. Morgan Robertson called The Wreck of the Titan. It is an unusual novel describing the doomed voyage of a luxury liner called Titan, Titan, which in the book happens to be the largest and most glamorous liner ever constructed. It carries the wealthy and prominent of her time on her April maiden voyage between Southampton and New York as she sets out to break a nautical speed record. In the middle of the night, in this book, this novel, the Titan strikes an iceberg and happens to sink, killing most of the passengers on board as a result of an insufficient number of lifeboats. Get this, the book, The Wreck of the Titan, was published in 1898, 14 years before the Titanic sank. How does that happen? That may not be an answer we'll ever find anytime soon as well. Any other odd similarities between the fictional Titan and the Titanic, the book, and the real deal? Yeah. Now, book and Titanic, real. Both maiden voyages occurred in April. The length of the actual Titanic, 882.5 feet. The length of the Titan in the book, 800 feet. The number of passengers on Titanic, 2,200. The number of passengers on the Titan in the book, 2,000. Here's something else that can give you a somewhat eerie feeling. Earlier during the day, the Titanic would hit the iceberg. There was a church service in the second-class dining room that afternoon. The hymn everybody happened to have been singing during the service was entitled, "Eternal Father, Strong to Save for Those in Peril on the Sea." Or, how about the following? You might not believe in astrology, but the ship's horoscope on the day of the ship's birth went like this. May 31st, 1911, which is Titanic's birth or launch date, says that among other things, astrologically, as far as the ship goes, that there is danger on or near water, accidents in travel, and sorrow and loss through relatives. And this is also quite interesting. On April 16, 1912, the British newspaper, the Daily Sketch, reported news from Liverpool, the place of Titanic's port of registration, that, and I quote from the paper, shortly before 9 o'clock last evening, which was the night that the ship sank, the entire electricity supply of Liverpool failed suddenly. The streets were plunged into darkness, electric cars came to a sudden standstill, and all social life was held up. It was fully 3/4 of an hour before normal conditions were restored. Coincidence? I don't know. Do you? Did you also know that on her first and only sailing, the Titanic was carrying 15,000 bottles of ale and stout, 1,000 bottles of wine, 850 bottles of spirits, 8,000 cigars, 57,600 items of crockery, 29,000 pieces of glassware, 44,000 pieces of cutlery, 3,000 teacups, 12,000 dinner plates, 5,500 ice cream plates, or how about 3,600 bed covers, 45,000 table napkins, 1,000 oyster forks, 1,500 grape scissors, yes, grape scissors, and 400 asparagus tongs. On her first and only sailing, the Titanic was also carrying some very interesting cargo, some of which was 5 grand pianos, 30 cases of golf clubs and tennis rackets for A.J. Spalding, a cask of china to have been delivered to Tiffany's on Fifth Avenue in New York City, 3 crates of ancient models for the Denver Museum, 50 cases of toothpaste, a brand new Renault 35 horsepower automobile, and so much more. Here are some of the ship's stats. Her length, 882 feet 6 inches. Her beam, 92 feet 6 inches. Her draft, 34 feet 6 inches. Her height, 175 feet from keel to stack, 9 decks, top speed 24 knots at 75 RPMs. Passengers, fully loaded, if it were, 739 in first class, 674 in second class, and 1,026 in third class, or more commonly known as steerage. On April 14th, there were 329 in first class, 285 in second class, and 710 third class passengers. Crew, 892, and officers, not including the captain, 7. How much would it have cost you to sail on the Titanic in those days? If you wanted a first-class luxury suite, it would have cost you $4,350. Today, that would translate to about $50,000 for a first-class luxury suite on the Titanic. How about what you would have earned if you had worked on the Titanic? The year was 1912. In today's money, Captain Smith earned, in today's money, about $72,500 per year, while a cabin stewardess earned about $2,400 per year. Titanic cost no less than $7.5 million to build, and had a $5 million insurance policy. Today, that would translate to about $400 million. So what was so different about Titanic? Well, everything. She was the 747 or Concorde of passenger ships of her day. Because of that, everybody and just about anybody wanted to sail on her, particularly if you could afford first class. Why? Just get this. As a first class passenger on the ship, you had a choice of 2 grand parlor suites, each with its very own 50-foot private promenade deck. There were also 67 other first-class staterooms or suites available for the taking. Each first-class suite or stateroom was specially designed in either Louis XVI, Louis XIV, Queen Anne, modern Dutch, Old Dutch, Italian Renaissance, Georgian, or Empire interior designs. There was a very well-equipped gymnasium. There was the very first heated swimming pool ever built on a ship. There was a squash court, a Turkish bath, a smoking room, reading and writing rooms, 2 barber shops with automated shampooing and drying appliances, a library, an amazing dining salon that could serve no less than 554 first-class passengers at any given time, an authentic Parisian cafe, and complete it was with French waiters. A veranda cafe was also to be found with actual palm trees, electric light and heat in every stateroom, not always a given on ships of the day, 4 electric elevators complete with elevator operators, a state-of-the-art hospital complete with operating room, with 2, count them, 2 physicians, a fully equipped dark room for amateur photographers, a Marconi wireless radio station for sending and receiving passenger telegrams. And if all of that wasn't enough, how about a 50-phone switchboard complete with real live operator for inner-ship calls? Second-class accommodations and public space was fine. Third class was kind of merely okay. In fact, get this, there were only 2 bathtubs for more than 700 third-class passengers. Despite what you may think compared to today's standards, the Titanic back in her day had it all. Not only that, but the builders and owners of the Titanic claimed that she was practically, unsinkable. She was also the largest vessel in the world at the time, and it would take no less than 640 tons of coal a day to get her to maintain a cruising speed of 22 knots, which is about 28 miles. She was built in Belfast, Ireland. Over 15,000 people worked long days to build her. Workers were paid an average of $10 a week. Work began in 1909. She sailed in 1912. So what the heck happened? Let's first spend a few minutes talking about how exactly the Titanic came about. The transatlantic trade was fiercely competitive. If you built a cruise ship that could get from Paris or London to New York in a record amount of time, faster than any other cruise ship, that was a huge coup. And the amount of luxury that was built into your ship was also a huge coup. 2 of the top players in that day were Cunard and White Star. Cunard already had 2 amazing ships on the North Atlantic run that were the talk of the town, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. They were also super fast in that they were able to cross the Atlantic in a mere 5 days. What was so special about that? It gave them, as I said before, the competitive edge. The less time you could spend at sea getting from one to the other place, the better. If you were going to travel across the Atlantic, wouldn't you want to be on the fastest and most luxurious ship? Speed and luxury, those two words were gold to any ship line on that route. And when ships are sailing, it still is the same to this very day. So here was the question back then. Could the White Star Line top these two amazing Cunard ships? You bet they could. And one person who fiercely believed that there could be something happening like that was a fellow by the name of J. Bruce Ismay, the director of the White Star Line. In the summer of 1907, at a dinner party, he had the idea of building not one, not two, but 3 ships that would outshine Cunard's ships in every way. The Olympic, the Gigantic or Britannic, as it was later called, and the Titanic were all going to be much larger, much more luxurious than anyone anywhere had ever seen before. Ismay originally sketched the plans for the Titanic on a napkin, and the rest is history. Boy, is it ever. Who exactly was on Titanic? Only a major list of some of the world's wealthiest folks in that day: John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, the unsinkable Molly Brown, Isidore Straus, the owner of Macy's department stores, and really the list goes on and on and on. How was it that Titanic was considered unsinkable, you might be wondering? It had a system of watertight doors that would close if there was any threat of water in that specific area of the hull, a technique that is still used to this very day. 4 of those doors could prevent the ship from sinking. If the water would have been too much for 4 watertight doors to handle, and the 5th door now happened to be needed, that's where the ship could no longer handle the amount of water. It was truly believed that nothing would be as catastrophic as to have the 5th door come into use. Also, what nobody realized back then was that the steel used to build the hull of the ship was actually way too weak. It had too much sulfur in it, which actually made it brittle. Not a good thing when an iceberg starts ripping a ship's hull apart. So what was the result of all this? A gaping 300-foot gash made by the iceberg, enough to sink the massive Titanic in only 2.5 hours. 2.5 hours is more than enough time to get all of Titanic's passengers safely off the ship, but not if you don't happen to have enough lifeboats, which was the case. With the number of lifeboats that the ship actually had, only 53% of the passengers could have made it off the ship. Sadly, only 32% of passengers and crew were actually taken off the ship in those lifeboats, and not one of those lifeboats left the ship full. Titanic sailed with a total of 2,223 souls on board. That's passengers and crew. 1,517 of those 2,223 were lost. Let me say that again. 1,517 of 2,223 were lost. 706 were saved. The process that those that survived had to endure to make it to the lifeboats was quite sad as well. Get this. There were twice as many first-class men as third-class children allowed into the lifeboats. Of 29 first and second-class children, all but one was saved. Of 76 third-class children, only 23 were saved. In total, 60% of the first-class passengers were saved. 60% of first-class passengers were saved. 42% of the second-class passengers were saved, and 25% of third-class passengers were saved. 24% of the crew were saved. Sad to think that this was Captain E.J. Smith's last sailing before he was to retire. He had amassed a brilliant 38-year career at sea with the White Star Line, and all he had to do now was sail the Titanic to New York and then live out the rest of his life ashore with his wife and 12-year-old daughter. Instead, it is said that he went down with his ship as he knew deep in his heart that he had failed not only himself, but all of his passengers and crew. It is also interesting to note that many of the ship's crew didn't even join the ship until a few hours before it sailed. So what do you think that meant? No proper lifeboat drill was done for and by the ship's crew and passengers before she sailed. Only 2 lifeboats were lowered in Southampton before the Titanic sailed. After 30 minutes, they were hoisted back onto the ship. No proper lifeboat assignments were accomplished, and in those days, passengers weren't even given lifeboat stations like they are nowadays. So, what exactly happened? On that fateful night, Captain Smith was invited to a private dinner party in the a la carte restaurant. At 7:30 p.m., there was another warning of ice flow, this time from a ship by the name of the California. The 2 crew members on duty in the crow's nest of the Titanic at 9:30 p.m. were asked to keep a close watch for ice flow. The captain, at 8:55 p.m., leaves the dinner party and checks in on the bridge. He tells his officers he'll be in his cabin should they need him. Did he tell anyone to slow down the ship because of ice flow? No. Why? Because he figured that the lookouts would see any dangerous looking flow reported, and the ship would then have time to slow down. At 9:30 p.m., another ice flow warning from another nearby steamer is sent to the Titanic. One of Titanic's radio room officers puts the message aside and doesn't have it delivered to the bridge. After all, this was about the 3rd ice warning that night, and the radio room was far busier with passengers' messages that had to be transmitted to shore. Only one of those many ice warning messages ever made it to the bridge. At 10 p.m., a ship called the Californian that was closest to the dangerous ice flow shut down for the night and decided to stop sending helpful messages to other ships about the dangerous ice flow. The disaster of the Titanic was now only 45 minutes away. Anyone on deck that night could literally smell the fact that there was dangerous ice flow around. The Titanic's log books had no mention of it, of course, and lookouts couldn't see as well as they might have because the night was totally clear with no moon. The unusual reflections on the sea were just not there that night. Plus, no one could find any binoculars. So by the time the fatal iceberg was spotted, it was almost too late to steer clear of it. And that actually occurred at 11:39 p.m. Once seen, the ship tried everything and anything to avoid the iceberg. They tried to stop and reverse the engines. They tried to turn the ship to avoid hitting the iceberg, but they couldn't turn it fast enough in the brief time they had to get out of the iceberg's way. Instead, the berg hit the riveted plates of the ship's hull, that steel, on the right, causing the rivets to pop open, allowing water to come in. The captain, hearing that the iceberg hit, immediately ordered the watertight doors to be shut, but his officers had already done just that. Third-class passengers, some of them were knocked out of bed when the hit occurred. Most first-class passengers barely noticed a thing. How could they have known that in a short amount of time, most of them would be standing helplessly on the ship's decks? They weren't getting off. They were just looking and waiting for the end to occur. Here are some passenger accounts, actual words from Titanic passengers. Here's the first one. This was given by Lawrence Beasley, a Titanic survivor, when he said, "Many brave things were done that night, but none more brave than by those few men playing minute by minute as the ship settled quietly lower and lower into the sea, the music they played serving alike as their own immortal requiem and their right to be recorded on the rolls of undying fame." That was alluding to the orchestra in first class that kept playing as the ship was going down. A guy by the name of Charles Lightoller, second officer aboard the Titanic, said this: "Striking the water was like 1,000 knives being driven into one's body. The temperature was 28 degrees, 4 degrees below freezing," he said. Ava Hart, a Titanic survivor, said this: "The sounds of people drowning are something that I cannot describe to you, and neither can anyone else. It is the most dreadful sound, and there is a terrible silence that follows it." Ava Hart also said this: "My mother had a premonition from the very word go. She knew there was something to be afraid of, and the only thing that she felt strongly about was to say that the ship was unsinkable, was flying in the face of God." Those were her words, Ava said. And finally, there is this. I'll quote: "Not until the last 5 minutes did the awful realization come that the end was at hand. The lights became dim and went out, but we could see. Slowly, ever so slowly, the surface of the water seemed to come towards us. So gradual was it that even after I had adjusted the life jacket about my body, it all seemed a dream. Deck after deck was submerged. There was no lurching or grinding or crunching. The Titanic simply settled. I was far up on one of the top decks when I jumped. About me were others in the water. My bathrobe floated away, and it was icily cold. I struck out at once. I turned my head, and my first glance took in the people swarming on the Titanic's deck. Hundreds were standing there helpless to ward off approaching death. You have to excuse me. This is pretty emotional. This survivor goes on to say, I saw Captain Smith on the bridge. My eyes seemingly clung to him. The deck from which I had leapt was now immersed. The water had risen slowly and was now to the floor of the bridge. Then it was to Captain Smith's waist. I saw him no more. He died a hero. The bows of the ship were far beneath the surface, and to me, only the 4 monster funnels and the 2 masts were now visible. It was all over in an instant. The Titanic's stern rose completely out of the water and went up 30, 40, 60 feet into the air. Then, with her body slanting at an angle of about 45 degrees, slowly the Titanic slipped out of sight. That chilling description was given by a guy by the name of Robert W. Daniel, who was a Philadelphia banker. So the question remains, could the tragedy of the loss of the Titanic have been prevented? There are a couple of reasons that actually point to yes. If Titanic had been more mindful of the ice flow they saw that night, well then maybe. If Titanic had sped up just a little more once the iceberg was spotted, they could have had enough speed to turn the ship and completely miss hitting the iceberg, well then maybe. If the captain and his officers had taken the 7 warnings that they got about icebergs in the area more seriously, well then maybe. And if the crew and officers had had better training, well maybe. If the ship had hit the iceberg head on and not turned to avoid it, well, maybe. If Titanic had enough lifeboat space for every single person on board, well, maybe. If the captain of the Titanic had not ordered all of the lifeboats at the same time of the sinking of the ship and off the ship without each one being full, well, maybe. But maybes, particularly in this case, are nothing more than maybes. How unfortunate and tragic that the whole thing had to happen the way that it did. And the most interesting thing about it to me is that the world will never forget this event that is now firmly lodged in our minds forever. Here are 2 quotes that prove that the tragedy of the Titanic is firmly etched into our modern culture. This first one is by Irma Bombeck, when she once said, "Seize the moment. Remember, all those women on the Titanic were waved off the dessert cart." And a guy by the name of Dave Barry, who said, "Never be afraid to try something new. Remember that a lone amateur built the Ark. Remember, a large group of professionals built the Titanic." As long as the wreck of the Titanic sits at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, that's as long as people will continue to marvel at the mystery of this great but doomed ship. In closing, here's an interesting quote and a statement that I came across when I was researching this talk. The first, and it's a quote by Walter Lord, who was a famous Titanic historian and author goes like this. I still think about that might have been and those might have beens about the Titanic. That's what stirs me more than anything else, he said. Things that happened that wouldn't have happened if only one thing had gone better for her. If only so many if-onlys. If only she had enough lifeboats. If only the watertight compartments had been higher. If only she had paid attention to the ice that night. If only the Californian did come to her rescue. If only keeps coming up again and again. And that makes the ship more than the experience of studying the disaster. It becomes a haunting experience to me. It's the haunting experience of if only, or in my terminology, what if? The ship and its horrific fate serve as a reminder about how fragile the human condition really is. And with that said, here's the statement. Someone once said that what happened to the Titanic that fateful night is a true symbol of the human condition, a symbol of our precarious life together on this floating planet out in a sea of starry space. What an event, what a lesson, what a tragedy, what a lesson in what it is to be here for the short time that we are. I hope you enjoyed this presentation of the Titanic, and I'd like to thank you for being here with me. This has been Robert Landau, Live Life Well TV host. Thank you, and God bless.